Begin the current Daf, Mesechtes Nedarim Daf Ayin Aleph. We begin the top line of the Amid. We continue Halacha, the next Mishnah, continue on this theme regarding the topic of this parak of Nair Marasa, which is regarding this girl that's engaged. So she has two people that have the ability and actually need the partnership of each other to be made for the neder. That is her father and her chassan. And together they are mafir Nadirim, and our Mishnah is going to describe actually when there's multiple chassanim, it regards to who gets the ability to be made for her neder. Shis corresponds with Kazakh and Cheskel, 10th of Daf Yomi. Shem Jon today's Daf should be a full shlema for Rivka Bas Shoshana Rezel. Shavu Shalema is having a procedure today. Shavu Shalema, and should be Leil Nishmas Abimari Mishar Mishmo Zabalevi Olav Shalom should be Elo Fez Neshama. Some things we discuss in today's Daf are Niskar Shaboy Bayoim, Nisar Saboy Bayoim. What happens if she actually got divorced on that day and she got engaged on that same day when she had originally made a neder with her chassan and her father? The halacha is her father and her last chassan together are going to be made for the neder. And the Gemara is going to be the sources for the halacha that aras made for nedarim hakoyim meshutves ta'av, that the chassan can be made for the nedarim that were pre-existing if it's with the partnership of the father. And aras achron meifa fil nedarim shenir aras rishon, meaning, as we'll see that what the chidushim in these are, that the later chassan could be made for the neder with the father, even that the first chassan already had seen, meaning / heard about it, and then he died, and still the last chassan could go ahead and be made for that neder. The Gemara brings the discussion whether av meifer b'shutfis when nira la'aris the hefer, and the complexities of every case is going to be the main idea of today's daf, of that if the aris heard about it and he was made for it, but nira la'av and the father did not hear about it, and then now there's a new chassan, whether the av is being made for b'shutfis of the chassan, or no, now the father himself could go ahead and do it if the first chassan had died. So we begin the current daf Ayin Aleph. Says the Mishnah, Nadra v'yarusa. So again, we're talking about this topic of this parak Nair Marasa. The girl's engaged, and again, there's two people that together are made for a neder, the father and the chassan. So she makes a neder when she's engaged. Then nisgarsha by bayam. So the shidduch breaks. He divorces her. There was this actual kedushin. He divorced her that day, and on that day when she had taken the neder, he divorces her. And nisgarsha by bayam, that same exact day, she gets engaged to someone else. Says the Mishnah, even if there was 100 chasanim, so one after another, engaged, divorce, engaged, divorce, engaged, divorce. So avio baila achron mafir nedirah. So her father and her last chasan together are made for her neder. Now the reason for this is because an oris, a chasan, can be made for b'koidmin, could make a nullification of a neder, what was pre-existing before he came into the picture, which he came in, she made the neder 11 o'clock in the morning. At 3 o'clock, after she has this marathon of marrying as many, getting in the Guinness Book of World Records, how many guys you can get engaged to in one day. And the 100th guy, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, she already had this neder before he came into the picture. Still, b'shutfis the av, since the father was always in existence in this picture, and for him it's not a problem by koidman, so the chassan together with the father could be made for even though it was pre-existing before him. Now the Ran explains, why do we have to say that she got divorced that day and got engaged that day? What do you mean? What's the problem? I thought you're saying it's not a problem about pre-existing. So if the father was there all along, so why can't you go ahead and be on a different day? Says the Ran, because the Tumah where they already heard it. Either the chassan or the father already heard the neder on the day that she made it. And therefore it has to be specifically that day that the 100th chassan is being made for the neder. Because if it's the following day, you can't do it anymore. Because since one of the parties already heard it on the prior day and wasn't made for it, didn't nullify it, so he's kayim the neder, he's validating the neder. And the Gemara is going to go through a whole discussion, who is it that heard it? Right, you're saying it has to be that day, boy bayoim, because if not, it's already makoyim. Who heard it already? Was it the father, or was it the chassan? And now that one of them heard it, you're saying that still the subsequent chassan together with the father is going to be made for the neder, and that's why it has to be that day. Who is it that originally heard of it that now is not here, is either here or not here, but the original chassan is not here, and now you're saying this last chassan is going to be able to take over? That's going to be a big part of that discussion. What? Who? The last chassan we don't care. He doesn't have to hear it because he can be made for bekoidman. It could be even a married man cannot be made for bekoidman. If his wife had taken the neder when she was dating and now he gets married to her, he cannot be made for pre-existing. But as a chassan, together with the father, since the father it's not koidman for, so the chassan with the father can be made for. So that part is not going to be the difficulty in our sukkah. The difficulty is going to be nisroikna, this whole thing about who is it that originally heard, and now the last, was it the father? Was it the chassan? And now the first chassan is not here anymore. Now we have the last chassan. So what's this last chassan doing? Whose role is he taking over? And what type of role is he taking over? Is it a weak? Is it strong? Because someone already heard and was not made for. Oh, but still Kaidman. Oh, here you're saying B'yom Shammai.
Yes, but no, that's what he hears.
I suppose, yeah, but it's a good question, but I still think it's Kaidman because it's still before he ever. It wasn't Beveis Isha. It wasn't Beveis Isha. So it says the Mishnah Zehakal. This is the rule. Kol shlo yatzel l'shus atzma sha'achas. As long as she didn't go into her own domain for one moment, meaning she did not become a begeres, which removes her from the father's domain, and neither did she have nisuin, which nisuin removes her. There's two things, there's two stages. People don't realize by chuppah, we do kedushin and we do nisuin. She didn't get married yet. As long as she didn't have any one of those things, and therefore she was always in her father's domain, aviu ba'ila ha'achron mefina dida. Her father and her last chassan together could be made for her neder, because had she become a begeres, or if she got married, she left the father's domain, and the aris on his own would not be able to be made for, because that would be kaidman. But as long as she didn't have either one of those two, the father is always still in the picture, and the last chassan could join him to be made for her neder. Okay, says the Gemara, Minalan, from where do we know the aris achrein, that the last chassan can be made for Nedarim, not because it's kaidman, that's not the Gemara's question, to made for Nedarim, shenidu la'aris rishon. That's going to be the difficulty. Meaning, as the Ram points out, what the Gemara's question is. You said in the Mishnah, she took a neder at 11 o'clock in the morning. She got divorced at 12 o'clock. At 1 o'clock, the shadchan worked very quick. She's engaged to someone else. Now, obviously, it must be talking about, says the Ran, that the first chassan who was engaged to her at 11 o'clock in the morning had heard her neder. Why? Because if not, why do you need boy bayim? Why do you need it to be the same day? The neder doesn't have any potency until, meaning at least to limit your 24 hours until it's heard. So why would it need to be boy bayim? It could be 3 days later, and the father hears about it. He says, "What, Shana? You took such a neder," and he only hears it that day. Then he has 24 hours then. So the next chassan could come in 3 days later. Why does it have to be that day? Oh, must be. Oh, the first chassan heard about it. And if he heard about it, the clock starts ticking. And therefore it has to be that same day that her new chassan comes into the picture. Oh, if the new chassan's coming in, and you're saying the first one, how do you know that if the first chassan had heard about it, what's called nidu la'aris rishon, how do you know that the second chassan could take over? And we'll go into great detail in the Ran, why should that be significant? But how do you know that even if the first chassan heard about it, that now the second chassan could come along and be made for such a neder? Now, the Ram first points out, he says, wait a second. How does the Gemara know, the Gemara saying Menolan, how does the Gemara know that the first chassan heard about it? You could reject and say, yes, it has to be by Bayom, but not because of the first chassan. Maybe the father heard about it. And that's why it says by Bayom, because the father heard about that and the clock starts ticking there also. But if the Aris heard it, maybe I would tell you that the last Aris cannot be made for. As I freaked it on the Gemara's Kasha. How do you know? You're telling me you want to know that even if it was Nidul Aris Rishon, how do you know? Who said? Who said it? Maybe it's only Shama Aviyah. You're right, maybe even Nidul Aris Rishon, the last chassan cannot go ahead and be made for. Says around, even so, you're right, it's a good question. But Shmuel had a Kabbalah from his Rebbe that when we learned in the Mishnah Boy Bayom, and again, Boy Bayom, to say someone heard, was because the first chassan heard it. And that's why he's saying, Minahan Amili. Our gear says Minolan, but where do you know this from? Because as the Ran explains, this question of Minolan is not the Gemara asking the question. This is all part of Shmuel's statement. Because now we're going to, after the question, we say, Amar Shmuel. So it sounds like the Gemara asked, and then Shmuel's giving an answer. No, it's all Shmuel's teaching, as if the Gemara says, Amar Shmuel, how do we know this idea that Aris Achrain is made from the Shnei Larishan? As Ram brings a well-known Gemara, every kid starts learning this Gemara. The first Gemara every kid basically starts learning is Elam Mitzias. The first Gemara there on their first Mishnah, the Gemara says, well, what's Paris Mivuzarn? What does it mean, scattered Paris? The Gemara says, Vikama. The Gemara says, Rabbi Yitzchak, it's a Kav and Daled Amos. Says the Ran, it's obvious from the Gemara over there that it wasn't the Gemara's kasha and then Rabbi Yitzchak answered. It was all Rabbi Yitzchak. It was all in Rabbi Yitzchak's interpretation that he was saying, Vikama, and that's Rabbi Yitzchak says it's this amount. So he says that the same thing is now Gemara. This question of the Gemara is not really a question. Who said you even have a question? Who said it was near Laur's Rishon? No, it's all part of Shmuel's Misori that he had, that our Mishnah was talking about, that it was the first chassan who heard about it. And also says the Ran, the Sugya is also proves that the halacha itself that we're asking is not like Shmuel's just explaining the source of that halacha. He is the halacha, meaning he's saying the halacha, and not only the raya of the pasuk. Because if it would be that this halacha is inherent in the Mishnah, and Shmuel's not saying anything, he's just proving it from the pasuk, as it sounds like when you simply read our Gemara, and that's why many people who would just learn the Gemara without the Ran would just read it like that. Says the Ran, then wait a second. How's the Gemara going to bring a Tanya Kava Seder Shmuel? The Gemara is going to shortly bring, I have a brisa that says like Shmuel. And what's the brisa? The Gemara is going to bring a brisa of Nedarim Daf. He says, if you look at the brisa we're going to quote shortly, it doesn't prove anything of the pasuk of Shmuel, of this halacha. And if the halacha itself was not Shmuel, was just the Mishnah, then what are you bringing more from the brisa than from the Mishnah? Says the Ran, no, because the halacha itself is Shmuel saying. Because although we're saying it based on the Mishnah, but like we said, the Mishnah itself you can reject and say it's not talking about the Shama Ardus Rishon, it was Shama Av. That's why the Gemara is going to bring Misayele from a brisa, which you can't reject. And that's going to be clear that it's going to be that the first chassan heard it. And even so, the last chassan can be mefer. So very important Ran. Again, reading this Gemara without the Ran said you missed the boat. Because it's not that Shmuel is just going to bring the source of the pasuk from that, because then the Gemara is telling us it's not going to help at all. The halacha itself that the Gemara is saying Menalan is Shmuel, because it's not clear from the Mishnah that way. He says a Messiah that when the Mishnah said Boy Bayam was because the Agas Arishan heard, but really you could say it's just as well the father. Be that as it may, that based on the Ran's interpretation, the Gemara is Shmuel saying, so how do I know this idea? Meaning, what's the source of this halach of the Messiah, of the Mishnah that I have? Amar Shmuel. Shmuel says, Amar Kar, the Pasuk says in Mamidbar. It says, regarding the Naira Hamarasa, it says, ish. If a girl that's single gets engaged to a man, and she has a Nadarim on her, what does it mean it's on her? It was on her from beforehand. Meaning that we see that it was a pre-existing neder, which b'chlal, that's the source that we said that the chassan can be made for nedarim that were koidmin. But the Gemara seems to understand this as referring to that even if there was a first chassan, now that when she gets engaged to a second chassan, that, what was pre-existing, that the chassan can be made for the father. So how do you know that? Maybe this told much near Oris Rishon. Maybe it's where the first chassan never heard about it. But let's say there were Nedarim that were heard by the first chassan. Maybe maybe the last chassan cannot be mefer. Now, why should that be? Up until now, we didn't explain yet. Why should it be different? Who cares? If you tell me that the chassan can be mefer b'koidman, whatever was there beforehand, whether there was another chassan before him, whether there wasn't, and if there was another chassan, so who cares that if the first chassan had heard about it or not, that you're making this big differentiation that so the Ran explains. Since the first chassan had heard about it, we're not going to be able to say this concept, what's called nisroikna, that it should get emptied out, that it should get poured out to the rishus of the last chassan. Why? What should happen? It should go to the father. As the Gemara said on Daf Ayin Mabez in the previous Daf, from the hekesh of Havayas. We had said in the same pasuk that we're quoting now, we brought on the previous Daf, it says, ish. We said, what's this Hayosiyah? Two Havayas. So we said, Makash Havayah Rishayin Havayah Shniya. We said, just like before the first Chassan, the father himself was made for. We said, before the second Chassan, also the father's mefer, which that was the source of the halacha of nisroikna, because there was a first chassan, and then he dies, it gets emptied out into the bucket of the father. So therefore we should say that Nedarim that were already heard by the first chassan, the second chassan is like he's not here, because the first chassan already did his thing, and now, meaning he had heard it, and therefore now it should be emptied out to the father. Who are you, the second chassan? And therefore the father should be mefer. So that's the Gemara's question. Maybe it's nirla agas rishain, so that he had schusim already, because he already heard it, so that schusim gets poured over to the father. So how does the second chassan come in over here and have rights to be mefer with the father? Or another approach you could say is that since there's a chassan and he cannot be mefer, because like we said, the first chassan already used up the part of the chassan part, and he cannot be mefer the second chassan, so the father also should not be able to mefer. Because when there is a chassan, a father cannot be mefer himself. So either one of those, says the Ran, is the Gemara's question. How do you know that the father and the chassan together are going to be mefer b'shutfis this last chassan, even if the first chassan heard about it? Again, the reason why that's more important, because it gets activated when he hears it. Now his chusim start. So now, and we know that when he dies, it goes to the father. So now when she gets engaged with someone else, the father already has it. So why are you saying the last chassan is mefer together with the father? Says the Gemara, Allah kra yeseru. This is the source of Shmuel. This Allah in the pasuk is an extra word, because it's coming to tell us every neder that's Allah, that even if it was already heard by the first chassan, is going to be carried over to the second chassan. As the Rush explains, it could have been written in the pasuk from Hoyoy Siyah Leish Unadereha, or Mifta Sevasa Asher Asra Al Nafsha. And I would have understood that a chassan could be mefer b'koidman, because it says Asher Asra, which sounds like already from the past. Why do I need to say Aleha? Says the Rush, that's what the Gemara means to say, is coming to include even the darim that were already heard by the first chassan. That's what the extra word Allah is coming to tell me, and that's the source of this halacha, the way Shmuel is explaining, inherent in the halacha of our Mishnah. Says the Gemara, and again, which this only makes sense according to the way the Ran explains, Tanya Kavasei de Shmuel. We learned in the Brisa, like Shmuel, that even the darim which were heard, what we call niru, to the first chassan, the second chassan can be mefer b'shutfis with the father. Because the Brisa says as follows, and it's a little bit of complex, and we're really just learning this small little piece of Gemara, and it just takes time to fully sift through it. The Brisa says like this: Naira Marasa, this basic halacha that we're discussing here in this parak, you have an engaged Naira, Avia Ba'al Mafir Nadir. That's the theme of this parak. So the father with her husband, with the chassan, are made for a neder. Says the Brisa Ketzad. How do you illustrate this? We're going to go through different cases. So Shama Avia. Let's say her father heard about her neder. He gets very upset. Tachtero, what are you doing? V'hafrla, and he's made for her neder. Okay, but he's not the whole picture, right? There's a chassan there too. Now the chassan wasn't around. She was just engaged. She was in their father's house, so the chassan was learning in yeshiva. He didn't get a chance to hear about it. L'shmaya shemes. The chassan he had a heart attack on his way to visit his kala, and he dies. Okay. Now, v'nesarsa boy ba'yoim. That same day, she gets engaged to the next lucky man. Now, says the Ran, the reason why we're saying boy ba'yoim is because if she would get engaged the next day, since when her chassan dies, it's nisroikna, as we said in the previous daf, it gets emptied out his cup into the father's cup, according to Beishamai, and he wasn't made for that day, so that's validating her neder, and it's already too late the next day. So it has to be that day she got engaged to someone else. Okay. And this is the halach of our Mishnah. Even if she gets engaged to 100 different people on the same day, whoever's the last man standing, avia ubayla ha'achrain mefir nedirah. Her father, together with the last chassan, together are going to be made for her neder. Now, the Ran says as follows. He says, some of the Rishonim explain that this first case of the Brisa is according to everyone. Meaning, because we're going to shortly bring a machlekes b'sham b'sil in the last cases of the Brisa, those Rishonim say that it's only in the end of the Brisa, that last case, they have machlekes b'sham b'sil. But this case, everyone agrees to. Says the Ran, he says, I wonder, According to Beis Hillel, and this was what we quoted on the previous daf, on a prior daf, that we said that it's tali in Machlekes Bisham Beis Hillel, as we said, of Megiz Gayis or Miklish Kalish, as we had discussed, regarding what happens when you do your part of the hafara, whether you be the father or the chassan. According to Beis Hillel, holds when one of the parties does the hafara, it's miklash kalish. It weakens the whole thing. It doesn't cut off anything. It weakens the whole thing. So the Ran wonders. He says, "Wait a second. Since the father heard about it, right? You have to follow the case. Shama via bahafala. The father heard about it, and he was mefer. So what does that do in the father's mefer? It weakens the whole neder, right? Because when it's a qualitative, it's not a quant. It doesn't cut off anything. It just weakens the whole thing when one of the party does it. Now the thing is, the father in this case is still alive, so his hafara never becomes batal. So whatever he's weakening is always going to stay over there. What ends up happening is the chassan who never heard about it, he died, and now we have a later chassan. Says the Ran. So you're telling me it's according to Old Rishayin, according to Old Tanoim, according to Beis Hillel and Beishamai? But according to Beis Hillel, how could you tell me that the father with the last chassan are going to be mefer? But we had Beis Hillel that we quoted in the previous daf that said, if Shama Avia v'hafrala, if the father heard about the neder and he was mefer it, and we said, v'lehispek habal lishmaya ad shemeis, and I mean in this case that we're talking about here in the Brisa, that the father did not get a chance, the chassan did not get a chance to hear about until he dies, that we said in the previous daf, Beis Hillel holds the father cannot be mefer. Why cannot the father be mefer? Because it said not even strong enough to hand over to the father, because the chassan didn't even hear about it. So it's not that it's not according to Beis Hillel that it weakens. So when the father weakened it, this was long round over there regarding explaining in what happens in the mechanics of Miklish Kalish. So the father weakened it, and the chassan barely even had anything because he never heard about it. So his chusim are very small. If you hear about it, it already expands your chusim. It stimulates your chusim because that's when you get a chance to be made because you heard about it. So chassan didn't even hear about it, and the chassan passed away. So he said, according to Beis Hillel, the father cannot be mefer because there's nothing here to be yarshening. So we see in such a case, we don't say meis habal nisreik nershus la'av. It doesn't get emptied out the cup of the chassan to the father because the neder was so weakened by the father's hafara. So it's not so significant, whatever the chassan had that now who passed away, to bequeath to the father. That's what we had from Beis Hillel in the previous daf. So says around here also, when you have the chassan when you have the father with the last chassan, what's the difference? When the first chassan passed away, the case is really the same thing. It was Shama via Bahafala. The chassan didn't get a chance to hear about it until he died. The only thing that's different here in this brayse is that she got engaged that same day. But Beis Hillel already said, in this same exact case, with barring that getting engaged to other people, the father himself cannot be mefer, because he's not going to say nisreikna. So how does it help when there's a later chassan to them to be mefer b'shutfus? That's the Ran's kasha. Says the Ran, it appears to me, according to the opinion of these Rishonim that we're explaining, that this first halacha could be like Beis Hillel also. The reason is like this. Because previously, that there was a shina rishus, there was a change of domain, because you're removing the neder when the chassan dies to the father. That's essentially what happens. That's what nisroikna is. Gets emptied out from the chassan, and you're switching ownerships to the father. And that, wherever it gets weakened, it's not strong enough to displace it and move it over to the father. But over here, where there's a last chassan, we look at the last chassan, and the words of the Ran are kikari derishin. He's like the knees of the first one, which brokar davur. That's the ilun neshama. That's why dam v'damid today. Brokar davur. I'm like an extension of my father. So he says the last chassan is filling the shoes of the first chassan. Oh, says the Ran. So even though the neder got weakened, the father with the chassan can be mefer because that's not really moving anything. So that's why it's different than that case of Beis Hillel. Yeah, you could say this halacha is like Beis Hillel too, because even though it sounds like it's the same case. The same case. Mamish shama v'yavav alav hizvei abal lishma shemeis. Stop. That was the case we said Beis Hillel. The father himself cannot be mefer. Why not? because it's negligible, we said. What the first chassan had, he didn't really have anything. His portion, he never really heard about it, and then he died, so the father can have it made for himself. So the Ran's saying, so why over here could the Avi Bal Achim according to those Rishonim that hold that it's even like Basil, that's Mikdash Kodesh, so he says, oh, because he's the last chassan, it's like he's like Tchias HaMesim. He's boop, you smash around those hats and they pop back up, he's back. It's not intik. It's not removing anything. It's not really Yairish. It's like here. And that's why, says the Ran, it could even be like Basil, this halacha. Okay. This is the ratio. It's not the main thing that we really want from here. Continues the Brisa. Shama bala v'hafala. Let's say the husband heard about it and he was made for it. So says the Ran. This case also is talking about that she's engaged, because the first case was talking about where she was engaged, and this case is not disagreeing with the Reisha. The only difference between these cases are that by the first case, the father was mefer, and then the chassan didn't hear about it and he died, and they were talking about where the chassan was mefer. So it says the Brisa, Shama ba'ala b'hafala, if a chassan heard about the neder, and he was mefer it. So they were on a date, and this chassan kala, and she's saying, I'm taking a neder that I'm never gonna, every day I'm gonna write a note to you, I'm never gonna forget to write a note to you. Every single day I'm gonna put one in your Gemara. And he's made for it, says, no, I don't want you to have such a neder. Now the father never heard about it. He only heard about it by the shiva. He hears about it by the chassan who was nifter, and he hears about it, he says, yeah, she took a neder when they were engaged, that she's gonna write a note every day for the next 10 years. So what's the halacha? She took the neder. She didn't make it dependent on whatever. She said, next 10 years she's going to write a note and put it in his Gemara. So even though he's dead, now she would have to put it into his Gemara every day for the next 10 years. And he only heard about it by the Shiva. So says the Brisa, Chayzer Av u'meifer chelka shabal. The father now could go ahead and nullify the portion of the chassan. What's this talking about? So we need the Ran to explain. It says what's going to happen now is the father himself is going to be made for her neder, even though she got engaged to someone else. So at the Shiva, 3 days later, she's already engaged, and they're there by the chassan's family, and at the Shiva, he hears his daughter telling the parents of the chassan, of the first chassan, said, yeah, when we were dating, I swore that I'm going to put a note in his Gemara every day for the next 10 years. And the father says, what do you do? And she's already engaged as our new chassan. They're also coming to Menachem Avil by the first chassan. And the father says, that's it. No, over my dead body, no, I'm being made for your neder. The father himself is made for the neder that she took with her first chassan, who was made for it on the date when they were together. And the reason for this is, as we're going to explain later on, it's going to be based on the principles of Nisroikna, that the father takes over those rights from the first chassan. Now, the Ran just points out, when the Bryce is saying that the father is going to be chayzru mei for chelkei shel baal, of course, says the Ran, the father is also being made for his part too. There's two partners in a kala that makes a neder. There's the father and the chassan. That we don't have, the Tana doesn't have to tell us. That's obvious that the portion of the father can't be removed without his hafara. It's only that the chiddush that the Bryce is coming to tell us is that the portion of the chassan is what we need to tell you. That even though the first chassan already was made for his chelik on the date, he told her, no, sheifela, made for his nederecha is no, you're not putting a note in my Gemara for the next 10 years. You don't know what's going to happen. You might be in the hospital. You gave birth to a baby. Can't take such a neder. Even so, the father could go back and be made for even that portion of the chassan. Why are you being made for it? He already was made for it. No, because when the chassan died, his hafara is batal. So the father now, who's going to get nisroikna from the first chassan, of course he's made for his own chelik. We're just saying the chiddush is that he's also going to be made for the chelka shel Oris Rishon, even though she's already engaged to another chassan. That's the halacha of the Bryce. But that's not finished. Amr ibn Nasan, he says, Hey, Nedarim Daf. Everything we said up until now is the opinion of Bishamai. Basiloimim, they disagree. They say, Ein Yachal Hafer. No, the father, without the last chassan, who she's engaged to now, who cannot be made for it, the father cannot be made for. So Bishame says that the father can be made for, the chelka shall baal, and with his own chelik, and Bishame says no, it cannot be made for. Says the Gemara, b'may pligi, what is the machlekes of this Bishame and Basil? Says the Ketindam Beis. It's a small little Gemara, but it's going to take us the rest of the daf. As we continue with Beis, Bishame Sabri, they hold as follows. And there's two components, and the Ran's going to explain this a little bit. What is going on over here? Bishame Sabri, they hold Nedarim, Nami, either gives to Shiro, but it's not really Shiro, it's really Sheniru. It's this idea. Even that was Niru, again, Niru, although it means seen, but it means that he heard it, that even Nedarim that were heard La'aris to the first Chasan, when he dies, Nisroik Nerishus La'av. It gets poured out, the rights of the chassan, to the father. What do you see from that? So therefore, since regarding this neder, the last chassan is like he's not here, as we're going to shortly explain, which is based on the second principle we're going to quote in a moment. But since the last chassan is not here, and we say nisraikna, even when it was heard by the first chassan, so the father can be made for. Meaning, don't say that although the last chassan is like he's not here, but maybe when you're going to pour out the rights that the first chassan had to the father, maybe that's specifically nedarim, what's called shaloi niru la'ares, that the chassan never heard about. But when he had heard about it, maybe then you wouldn't say nisraiknu. No, that's not the case. Even if the first chassan heard about it, even over there, because Lamaisa, if he heard about it, it's already he already activated his rights. Maybe now you cannot pour that out to the father. No, even over there we're going to say nisreik nerishus la'av. Oh, and therefore, although over here the first chassan heard about it, they were on this date that she said, I'm going to put this note in your Gemara every day for the next 10 years. And his hafara is like it's not here, because the moment that he died, he had a heart attack a few minutes later. It's batal. Even so, since the last chassan regarding this neder is like he's not here, the guy she got engaged to 2 days later, as we're going to explain in a moment. So therefore, since we're saying in this reikna, the father could be made for the neder by himself. That's why, according to Beis Shammai, because we say in this reikna, even by a neder that was near la'aris rishain, therefore, Beis Shammai is going to hold that the father can be made for himself. And really, Beis Hillel doesn't really necessarily disagree with this point. But there's a second point. Umegiz gayas. And also, when someone does a hafara, one of the two partners does hafara, he's cutting off half of the neder, meaning his portion in the neder, he's slicing off and saying, no, I don't agree to this. And that's what happens when one of the partners does hafara. So what does this do for us? So the Ran explains, this is on the second wide line, because there's many different Rishonim over here, and we're going to try to do the minimum. But he says like this, the reason is, because Beis Shammai hold of Megas Gaias. So what happened? Let's go through the mechanics. What happened in this story when this girl, the Kala, made a neder when they were on the date and the chassan heard about it, and he says, no, he's being made for the neder, and the father didn't get a chance to hear about it until the chassan already had died. He only heard about it by the shiva. When she's already engaged to this next chassan, at the shiva, he hears his daughter saying to the chassan's parents, he said, I want you to know your son was so caring and so thoughtful that I made this neder, and he was so thoughtful that he told me to be made for it, because, or else I would have been stuck doing this for the next 10 years. When that chassan was made for the neder, he was mevatel half of the neder totally. That's what Megas Gaias is. You slice it, you're cutting it off. So his action is concluded. And what happens is that the chassan's portion is totally out of the picture right now. Because Megas Gaias, you cut that off. You're out of the picture. Now, although when the chassan dies, his hafara is nullified, is batal, so that's part of the question. So what's happening? You tell me he's out of the picture, but his hafara becomes batal when he dies. Yes, but since the aris is already out of the picture, So therefore, this neder has no application anymore for a chassan anymore, because the chassan already sliced off his part. So the father is now without a chassan. Now, we already had resolved previously that whenever there's no aris, and there's no chassan, a father could be made for on his own. That was the previous daf that we said, V'im hoyoy siya le'ish, makish havaya shniya lahavaya rishayna. Just like before she got engaged the first time, the father's doing himself. So he said, same thing is when she gets engaged the second time, before she gets engaged the second time, which is when the chassan dies, so she's before her second engagement, we said that it's nisroikna. The father could go ahead and do the hafara himself. So, therefore, when the first chassan does hafara, he's out of the picture. Chassanim are out of the picture. Okay, and now that he dies, we're saying the strikna, so the father can be made for himself. But, says the Ran, the opposite, what we learned on Daf Samaches Amid Beis, when the father heard about the neder, and he was made for, even if you're going to say, according to the one that holds Megiz Gaius, that the father is removed, like we said, if you hold Megiz Gaius, that partner is out of the picture now. Even so, we said that when the father dies, his hafara is batal, and then we said the chassan is alone without a father, and therefore he cannot be mefer, because an aris can only be mefer with an av, because we don't say nisroik in the rishus labal, but we do say when the chassan dies, it's going to be nisroikna l'rishus ha'av. So that's the reason of Beis Shammai that they say that the father could be mefer over here without the last chassan. Because again, chassan is out of the picture, and you will say nisraikna from the chassan to the father, because Amaisa his hafar is batal, and therefore the father on himself can be mefer only because Beis Shammai holds Megiz Gaius, because that slices you out of the picture. You're not in the picture anymore. That's Beis Shammai. Says the Gemara, Beis Hillel they hold, and this is where we're going to end. Avia ubayla achran. No, the father and the last chassan, mefidin nidareha. They are mefer her neder. Meaning, the father himself cannot be mefer the neder. Why? Because veloy megiz gaius. It's not sliced off. Meaning, when the chassan does his hafara, you're not removing half of the neder. What happens? The whole neder becomes weakened. Okay, that weakening is not a complete action. You didn't really do you didn't finish anything. You just weakened you're playing those arcade games and you're fighting the big monster and he's getting weaker. Until you kill him, you're not done. He's still going to shoot you in the head. Your head's going to fly off. Right? You have to finish off the thing. So weakening is not done. Oh, so therefore it doesn't really take effect until you combine what you're weakening of it with the other partner weakening it. That's essentially what happens when the viu bailu mafir nedidah. If you hold miklish kolish, you didn't do anything. You didn't really finish it off. You just did your weakening. Oh, so therefore, as long as the father was not mefer, the chassan is not removed yet from this neder, even though he did his part. Yeah, but you're not removed from the picture yet. You're still waiting for the partner. You have the famous two keys. The two partners have to open up the vault together. Only one key is not going to open anything. So you have one key. Didn't do anything. You're not removed. You have to wait till the other partner comes with his key, and then you guys can open up the vault together. Oh, so therefore, says the Ran, the last chassan inherits what the first chassan had. Because the first chassan is not removed from the picture. It was only miklish kolish. So even this that he was mefer, he's not out of the picture yet. Now, although it's batal his hafara, because he died, okay, but the second chassan now steps into his shoes. Because he wasn't removed yet from the picture. There's no nisroikin over here. Therefore, Beis Hillel hold, no, you have to have a via ubayla achran to be mefer haneder. That's what the Ran says, nira be'enai bezeh. But he says, I still find some difficulties over here. What's his question? He says, why do we have to say, when we're explaining the reasoning of Beis Shammai, when we're explaining that even by Nedarim that were Niru La'aris, meaning that the Chassan had heard about. Still over there, we're going to say it's going to be Nisroik Nerishos La'av. The father, it's still going to be poured out to the father's rights, and that's why Beis Shammai holds that the father himself is made for the neder. But since according to Beis Shammai, the last Chassan is like he's not here, because we say according to Beis Shammai, it's make his gayas. Everyone agrees, even Beis Hill, that Nedarim that were heard by the Chassan, when you don't have a Chassan, which again, according to Beis Shammai is inherent, you don't have a Chassan because it make his gayas. So everyone knows you say Nisroik Nerishos La'av. That was the Gemara on the previous Daf in Daf Ayin Beis, that we said according to everyone, which the Gemara was discussing and saying, wait a second, maybe you only say this by Nedarim, Shloi Nirul artists that weren't heard by the Chassan, but Nedarim that were heard by the Chassan, maybe the father would not be able to mefer. And the Gemara comes out, no, that's not the case. That the father could be mefer. So you see that according to everyone agrees, you're going to say Nisroik Nerishos La'av, it gets emptied out to the father, even by Nedarim that were heard by the Chassan. So why does the Gemara need to tell us what's called the first halacha? There's two halachas we're saying by Beis Shammai. We're saying that there's a Nedarim that were heard by the Chassan that gets Nisroik Nerishos La'av, and we're saying Megis guys. And those two principles we need for Beis Shammai. Says the Ran, well, why do you need to say that according to Beis Shammai? Everyone agrees to that principle of Nir La'aris. Why are you saying that as a prerequisite? You're not explaining the whole halachas of Nedarim, but you're explaining what's unique to Beis Shammai. But that's not unique to Beis Shammai. Says the Ran, maybe what the Gemara is saying is that although over here you have two elements, what? First of all, that it was already heard by the first Chassan. Moreover, you also have a second later Chassan. Oh, so you would have thought to say that since the first Chassan had already had rights in this neder, why? Because it was already Kvar Niru. He already heard about it. So then you wouldn't say that it should get emptied out into the rights of the father, as long as at this point you still have a later Chassan. Because the later Chassan is Karei Derishin. He fills the shoes of the first Chassan. By Nedarim that the first Chassan had already had rights in. Because although the Chassan is removed, but since there's a later Chassan, maybe you would say that that later Chassan would be Ma'akab, would hold back on the father. That the father also should not be able to be Mefer, because you have a later Chassan. Says the Ran, Kamash Malan, that's the Chiddush that the Gemara is telling us, that's not the case, even though it was Nirul Agas Rishain, still we're going to say, even though there's a later Chassan, that's what the Ran's really adding on, we're still going to say Nisroikna Rishos Li'av. However, the Ran has to explain one more word. We had in our gears, so the top line of the Gemara was, Beis Shammai Sabri Nadar Nami. Also, Sheniru La'aris, even though they're going to say Nisroikna Rishos La'av. Says the Ran, the word Nami, he has to bavar, and he has to, for one, he has to explain, is not to say, oh, you mean when it was loy niru, when the chassan did not hear about it, it sounds like that would be for sure the father could be able to mefer, right? You're saying that even though the chassan heard about it, even over there when he dies, you're going to say it gets poured out to the father. Sounds like, but if the first chassan did not hear about it, alachas kam for sure that then the father can be mefer. So the Ran, no, adrabah, to the contrary. If the first chassan did not hear about it, actually, then you don't say Nisroik Nerishos La'av. Why not? Because you know what happens then? It's the last chassan that's going to actually have to be mefer with the father. Because he's going to get it. It's only because he did hear it that the father actually gets it. But if he didn't hear it, that's actually the first case of the Brisa. So what are you saying Nami then? Nami makes it sound like that for sure when he didn't hear about it, the father's going to get it. But it's not true. If he didn't hear about it, actually the father does not get it. The first chassan does. Says the Ran, it's only because of regarding the rights of the chassan that we're saying that the chassan's rights of being zeicha are stronger when he heard it than when he didn't hear it. And therefore, since the rights of the chassan are stronger when he heard it, so therefore that's where you could say that you would think to say that the father would not be able to mefer, because that's what we really said in the Gemara Daf Ayin Beis. Maybe you're going to say this halacha that the father gets it only when the Nedarim that the chassan never heard about it. But if he heard about it, maybe it cannot be mefer, and that's why the Gemara had to say nami, as in that part of the chiddush, to say that no, over here because the first chassan was mefer it, That was the case we're talking about. It's not just that he heard about it, he was also made for it. So that weakens the halacha of the last chassan. Because since the first chassan was already made for it, guess what happens according to Beis Shammai? It's a make his gayas. He's already removed from the whole picture. Not because of Niru, not because he heard it, it's because he was made for it. And because the rights of the chassan are stronger when he heard it than when he didn't hear it, so therefore that's what it's saying, that it's because that he was made for it, now the father's going to get it. That's how the Ran explains what the Nami is coming to tell us. Because of the hafara, that the chassan did it, that's why the father is actually going to get it. Or he says, if you want to, you could explain, it's because of what we're saying when there's no later chassan, then we're saying Nami. Because since when there's no later chassan, then Nir is actually a chiddush, as we said. Because if he heard about it, it's exactly the chiddush we said in the previous daf. So therefore we're saying this of even though it was Nir la'aris, just to say a chiddush when there's no later chassan. Okay, what's the conclusion of this? This is where we stop. We're not doing Yibaylu. That's going to be the next stop. So what's the conclusion of this sugya? So the Ran explains what we're bringing from this brisa is that when we said Tanya Mahachel Shmuel, we said, we have a brisa that says like Shmuel. What do you see from this brisa like Shmuel? Because Beis Hill say that the father and the last chassan are mafirin the neder, even though it was already heard by the first chassan. That's the whole point of Shmuel's halacha. Remember we said Menalan. What was the Menalan? Menalan, how do we know from our Mishnah? How does our Mishnah know this halacha, that even if the first chassan heard about it, that the last chassan is going to get it? Which, if you recall, we said that's really Shmuel. You don't see that from the Mishnah because it could be only Shama Avia, not Shama Balarishan. But we said that was the Messiah Shmuel had. So you see this from Beis Hill clearly, that there was a first chassan, and still the last chassan with the father is going to be made for it together. And says the Ran, even Beis Shammai really also doesn't disagree, only because the chassan had heard about it and he did the afara. Because Beis Shammai l'shitasi holds that's Megiz Gayis, that will cut it off. So then the chassan is already out of the picture, so a later chassan cannot take that over. But if let's say he heard it and it was not mefer, everyone would agree that the father and the later chassan would be able to mefer the neder together, even though the first chassan had already heard about it. That was the halacha of Shmuel that you see that he was learning in the Mishnah, which really you see from a brisa, that you see that even though there was a first chassan, the later chassan could go ahead, and even though the first chassan had heard about it, which we explained already why that's a chiddush, could go ahead and be mefer together with the father. Thank you to Anytime for hosting us.